I'm excited to welcome you to my channel. Before I dive into my story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Fishing at the secluded creek behind my grandparents' house was one of those simple, timeless routines that brought a sense of peace and tranquility to my life. The creek was hidden deep within the woods, far from the nearest road, and surrounded by towering trees that seemed to shield it from the rest of the world. The water was clear and cool, flowing gently over smooth stones that had been worn down by the current over countless years. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, where the worries and noise of the outside world couldn't reach me. I would often rise early in the morning, just as the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. The air would be crisp and fresh, carrying with it the earthy scent of the forest and the faint smell of the creek. I'd quietly gather my fishing gear, a simple rod and tackle box that had been handed down from my grandfather, and set out along the narrow path that led to the creek. The walk was always a calming experience, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle of wildlife in the bushes providing a soothing soundtrack to my thoughts. As I neared the creek, the sound of flowing water would grow louder, mingling with the chirping of birds and the gentle rustling of the wind in the trees. I'd find my usual spot, a small clearing where the trees parted just enough to let the sunlight spill onto the creek's surface, creating a dappled pattern of light and shadow that danced on the water. I'd sit down on the worn, sun-bleached rock that had become my makeshift seat over the years, and take a moment to simply breathe, letting the stillness of the place seep into my bones. Casting my line into the water was almost meditative. The rhythmic motion of the rod, the soft plunk of the bait hitting the water, the slight tension on the line as it settled, all of it combined to create a sense of calm that was hard to find anywhere else. There was something deeply satisfying about the simplicity of it all, the way the world seemed to narrow down to just me, the water, and the fish beneath the surface. Time would slip away as I sat there, watching the water ripple and flow, waiting for the telltale tug on the line that signaled a catch. Sometimes, I wouldn't catch anything at all, and that was fine by me. It wasn't really about the fish. It was about the connection to nature, the feeling of being a part of something bigger and more enduring than myself. The creek had a way of grounding me, of reminding me that life was more than just the daily grind and the endless stream of worries. It was a place where I could let go of everything and just be, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the natural world. The solitude was something I cherished. In those moments by the creek, I felt completely at ease, alone but never lonely. The forest was alive around me, filled with the subtle sounds and movements of creatures going about their day. I'd watch as a deer cautiously approached the water's edge for a drink, or see a heron standing still as a statue, waiting to strike at a passing fish. The birds would flit from branch to branch, singing their morning songs, and occasionally, a squirrel would scamper down a tree to investigate the intruder in its domain. There was a kind of unspoken understanding between me and the world around me. The creek, the trees, the animals, they all felt like old friends, familiar and comforting in their presence. I knew this place intimately, from the way the light shifted through the trees as the day wore on, to the best spots to cast my line for the biggest fish. It was a place where I felt safe, where the worries of the world couldn't reach me, and where I could simply enjoy the quiet pleasures of life. But as much as I loved those peaceful moments by the creek, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing. It was subtle at first, a slight shift in the air, a feeling of unease that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The forest, once so welcoming, began to feel a little too quiet, a little too still. The birds seemed to sing less, the rustle of leaves in the wind felt more like a whisper of warning than a lullaby. I started to notice things that hadn't bothered me before, the way the shadows seemed to linger a little longer in the corners of my vision, the occasional flash of movement just beyond the tree line. Looking back now, I realized that those were the first signs, the first hints that something was amiss. But at the time, I pushed those feelings aside, telling myself that it was just my imagination, that the creek and the forest were as peaceful as they had always been. I clung to the routine, to the familiar comforts of fishing and the solitude it provided, not wanting to acknowledge that the world I had known was beginning to change. It wasn't long before those subtle signs turned into something more, something that would shatter the peace and tranquility I had come to rely on. But in those early days, before everything started to unravel, I held on to the belief that the creek was still my sanctuary, a place where I could escape from the chaos of life and find a moment of calm. It was a belief that would soon be tested in ways I could never have imagined. That day started off just like any other. My sister and I had decided to spend the afternoon fishing at the creek behind our grandparents' house. The sun was shining, the air was warm, and the peaceful solitude of the woods surrounded us as we made our way down the familiar path. We weren't in a hurry, enjoying the sounds of nature and the comfort of being in a place that had always felt safe and secure. When we reached the creek, we settled into our usual spots, me on the worn rock that jutted out over the water, and my sister on a fallen log a little further down. The creek was calm that day, the water clear and inviting, and for a while, everything felt perfectly normal. We cast our lines, chatting idly about school, friends, and whatever else came to mind. It was one of those easy conversations, the kind you have when you're completely at ease and have all the time in the world. But as the minutes ticked by, a strange feeling began to settle over me. It was subtle at first, just a vague sense that something wasn't quite right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was an unease that slowly crept into my mind, making it hard to focus on the fishing. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, seemed to quiet down, leaving an eerie stillness in their wake. I glanced over at my sister, who seemed to be having the same feeling. She was no longer focused on her fishing line but was instead staring into the dense tree line on the other side of the creek. There was a tension in her posture, a subtle stiffness that I recognized as the first sign of fear. I felt my own heart begin to beat a little faster, the sense of unease growing stronger with each passing second. "What's wrong?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't answer right away, her eyes still fixed on the trees. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you feel like someone's watching us?" Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I hadn't wanted to admit it, but now that she'd said it out loud, I couldn't ignore the feeling any longer. It was as if the very air around us had changed, thickening with a creeping dread that settled in my chest like a heavy stone. I slowly turned my gaze to the tree line, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. At first, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, just the usual tangle of trees and underbrush, dappled with sunlight. But as I kept looking, something caught my eye. It was subtle, just a slight shift in the shadows, but enough to make my breath catch in my throat. There, just beyond the edge of the trees, was a figure. He was tall, unnaturally so, and his silhouette was partially obscured by the thick branches. At first, I thought it might have been a trick of the light, but as I squinted to get a better look, the figure moved, just slightly, enough to confirm that it was real. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the figure, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. He was standing perfectly still, with his hands on his knees as if crouching slightly, watching us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Even from a distance, there was something off about him, something that set every instinct in my body on high alert. The way he was positioned, the way he blended almost seamlessly into the shadows, it was as if he was deliberately trying to remain unseen, and yet, he wanted us to know he was there. "Do you see him?" my sister whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, my eyes still locked on the figure. "Yeah, I see him." For a moment, neither of us moved. We were frozen in place, caught between the urge to run and the primal instinct to stay perfectly still, hoping that if we didn't move, he wouldn't either. The seconds stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity as we waited for the figure to do something, anything, that would explain what was happening. But he didn't move. He just stood there, watching us, his presence more menacing with each passing moment. The longer we stared at him, the more details began to emerge from the shadows. His limbs were unnaturally long, almost spindly, and his posture was hunched in a way that suggested both patience and predatory intent. There was something distinctly inhuman about him, something that made my stomach twist in fear. My mind raced with possibilities. Who was he? What did he want? And why was he just standing there, silently observing us? I remembered the stories my parents had told us about the New Market cult, the tales of strange, unsettling figures who would appear out of nowhere, bringing fear and uncertainty with them. I had always dismissed those stories as just that, stories. But now, staring at the figure in the tree line, I couldn't help but wonder if there was some truth to them. "We need to go," I whispered urgently to my sister, finally breaking the silence. My voice was shaky, betraying the fear that was rapidly overtaking me. She nodded, her eyes wide with terror. We both began to gather our things as quietly as possible, trying not to make any sudden movements that might draw the figure's attention. My hands trembled as I reeled on my fishing line, my heart pounding so loudly in my chest that I was sure it would give us away. As we stood to leave, I risked one last glance at the tree line. The figure was still there, still watching, but now there was a subtle shift in his posture, as if he was preparing to move. That was all the motivation we needed. My sister and I broke into a run, sprinting back up the path toward our grandparents' house, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the stillness of the woods. Fear drove us forward, and we didn't stop running until we were safely inside the house, slamming the door shut behind us. We were breathless, our hearts racing, as we looked at each other, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. Neither of us spoke for a long moment, both of us too shaken to put our thoughts into words. But we both knew one thing for certain: whatever we had seen out there, it wasn't just our imagination. Something, or someone, had been watching us, and the safety and solitude we had always associated with the creek had been shattered. From that moment on, nothing would be the same. As soon as my sister and I caught sight of that eerie figure lurking in the tree line, an overwhelming sense of urgency took hold of us. The peaceful, familiar woods that had always felt like a sanctuary now seemed menacing, every shadow hiding some unknown threat. Our fishing gear, once handled with care, was now hastily shoved into our bags. The simple pleasure of our afternoon had been replaced with a bone-deep fear, and the only thought in my mind was getting back to the safety of our grandparents' house. Without exchanging a word, we both knew what we had to do: leave, and fast. My sister was the first to stand, her face pale and eyes wide with terror. I grabbed her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze that I didn't fully feel myself. The fear in her eyes reflected my own, and I could tell she was struggling to keep it together. The eerie silence of the woods, broken only by the occasional crunch of leaves underfoot as we moved, only added to the tension. As we started back along the narrow path, I found myself glancing over my shoulder repeatedly, half expecting to see the tall figure emerging from the trees, following us. Each time I looked, I saw nothing but the darkening woods behind us, but that did nothing to ease the knot of dread tightening in my chest. The memory of those unnaturally long limbs, that sinister posture, it was burned into my mind, and no matter how much distance we put between ourselves and that spot, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. We moved quickly, our pace just short of a run. The path that had always seemed so short and familiar now felt impossibly long, stretching out before us like a gauntlet we had to survive. My sister was breathing heavily beside me, her grip on my hand tightening with each step. I could tell she was scared, more scared than I'd ever seen her before, and it took everything I had to keep my own fear in check, to be the calm one, the protector, even though I was just as terrified as she was. As we hurried along the path, the forest around us seemed to close in, the trees crowding closer, their branches arching overhead like skeletal arms. The underbrush, once just part of the scenery, now felt like a series of obstacles conspiring to slow us down. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent my heart racing, my mind conjuring up images of that figure breaking through the trees to grab us. The further we walked, the more the sense of dread grew, wrapping around me like a cold, clammy fog that I couldn't escape. The tension between my sister and me was palpable, a shared silence that spoke volumes. Neither of us wanted to voice what we were feeling, as if saying it out loud would make it more real, would somehow summon that figure back to us. But the fear was there, growing with each passing minute, feeding off our uncertainty and the inexplicable nature of what we had seen. We had heard stories, dark, unsettling tales passed down by our parents, tales of the Newmarket cult and the strange, terrifying things they did, but those stories had always felt distant, like something that belonged to another time, another place. Now, those stories were too close for comfort, and I couldn't help but wonder if we had stumbled into one of those tales ourselves. My sister's hand was trembling in mine, and when I glanced over at her, I could see the tears welling up in her eyes. She was trying so hard to be brave, to hold it together, but I could tell she was on the verge of breaking down. I gave her hand another squeeze, trying to offer some comfort, but the truth was, I didn't know what to say. What could I say? I was just as scared, just as confused. The fear was gnawing at me, making it hard to think straight, to focus on anything other than getting back to the house. "We're almost there," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to reassure her or myself. She nodded, biting her lip to keep from crying, and we picked up the pace, our footsteps quickening as the familiar outline of our grandparents' house finally came into view through the trees. The sight of the house should have brought relief, but instead, it only heightened the sense of urgency. The house, with its old wooden walls and cozy interior, had always been a place of safety for us, a refuge from whatever troubles the world might throw our way. But now, as we hurried toward it, it felt more like a last line of defense, a place we needed to reach before the danger caught up with us. We practically burst through the front door, the old wood creaking loudly as we flung it open and stumbled inside. The warmth and familiar scent of the house enveloped us, but it did little to ease the fear that had taken hold. We slammed the door shut behind us, locking it with shaking hands, and then stood there, catching our breath, our backs pressed against the door as if it were the only thing keeping the terror at bay. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was our ragged breathing, the tension between us so thick it was almost suffocating. I could still feel the lingering presence of that figure in the back of my mind, the way he had watched us, so still and silent, from the tree line. It was a feeling I couldn't shake, no matter how much I tried to tell myself that we were safe now, that the house would protect us. Finally, my sister broke the silence. What was that?" she asked, her voice small and shaky. "I don't know," I admitted, hating the uncertainty in my own voice. "I don't know, but we're safe now. We're home." But even as I said the words, a part of me wasn't sure I believed them. The fear was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, and I couldn't help but feel that whatever we had seen out there, it wasn't done with us yet. I could see the same doubt in my sister's eyes, the same nagging worry that we hadn't truly escaped. We moved away from the door, our nerves still on edge, and went to the living room where the comforting presence of our grandparents' old furniture and family photos provided some small measure of reassurance. But the sense of dread lingered, a shadow that followed us from room to room. We didn't talk about what we had seen, didn't try to make sense of it, because neither of us had the answers. All we could do was cling to the familiarity of the house, hoping that it would be enough to keep the fear at bay. That night, we stayed close to each other, neither of us wanting to be alone. The house creaked and settled as it always did, but every sound seemed louder, more ominous. Every gust of wind against the windows, every rustle outside, sent a jolt of fear through me, and I could see my sister reacting the same way. We were both on edge, our minds replaying the events of the day over and over, trying to find some explanation, some way to rationalize what we had seen. But there was none. We went to bed that night, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound that might indicate we were not alone. My sister was curled up in the bed across the room, her breathing slow and even, but I knew she wasn't really asleep either. The fear had settled into our bones, a persistent, gnawing unease that wouldn't let go. As I finally drifted off to sleep, one thought kept circling through my mind. We had seen something we weren't supposed to see, something that didn't belong in our world of peaceful fishing trips and quiet afternoons by the creek. And whatever it was, it had seen us too. It was one of those nights when the silence felt heavy, like a thick blanket that smothered every little sound. The kind of quiet that makes you notice the creaks and groans of an old house settling, sounds that normally fade into the background but now seemed amplified, echoing through the stillness. I was home alone, my grandparents having gone out for the evening, and I had settled into the back room to play some games on my PlayStation. It was the only thing that kept my mind occupied, distracted from the eerie quiet that had fallen over the house. The hours slipped by as I lost myself in the game, the virtual world providing a comforting escape from the unease that had been gnawing at me ever since that day by the creek. I had on my soundproof headphones, shutting out everything except the sounds of the game and the voices of my friends who were playing with me. It was a small comfort, a way to push away the lingering fears that had settled into my bones. But then, something strange happened. My friends, who were usually focused on the game, started asking if I could hear something in the background. They kept telling me to listen, saying they could hear something through the mic. I was confused at first. There shouldn't have been any noise. The house was supposed to be empty, and the nearest neighbors were far enough away that any sounds from them wouldn't carry this far. Reluctantly, I paused the game and took off my headphones, and that's when I heard it. The sound was faint at first, almost drowned out by the quiet hum of the night, but it was there, a low, guttural noise that sent a shiver down my spine. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before, a strange, wounded animal-like sound that seemed to drift through the stillness of the night. It was the kind of noise that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, the kind that triggers some deep, primal instinct to run and hide. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, maybe just a stray animal in the woods. But the more I listened, the less convinced I became. There was something wrong with that sound, something off in a way that I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was too deliberate, too slow and drawn out, like something that was in pain, but also hungry. The fear began to creep in, slow and insidious, as the noise continued. I could feel my pulse quickening, the steady thump of my heart loud in my ears. My thoughts raced, jumping from one possibility to another, each more unsettling than the last. What if it wasn't an animal? What if it was something else, something that didn't belong in the woods, or anywhere near this house? I got up from the couch, my movements slow and cautious as I crept toward the window. I pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside, my breath catching in my throat as I scanned the darkness. The backyard was shrouded in shadow, the trees at the edge of the property looming like silent sentinels. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, casting everything in a murky, dim light that only heightened my sense of dread. The sound came again, this time a little louder, a little closer. It was moving, inching its way toward the house, toward me. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, a tight, suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe. I had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed. The house that had always been a place of safety and comfort now felt like a flimsy barrier against whatever was out there, stalking through the night. I couldn't see anything, but that only made it worse. The darkness outside seemed to press in on the windows, and I felt like a trapped animal, cornered and defenseless. My mind conjured up images of what might be lurking out there, twisted, shadowy figures with glowing eyes and sharp teeth, creatures that didn't belong in the world of the living. The fear was overwhelming, a cold, paralyzing dread that seeped into every part of me. The sound continued, growing louder, more persistent. It was no longer just a noise, it was a presence, something tangible and real that was creeping ever closer to the house. The idea of being alone in that moment, with no one around to help, was terrifying. I wanted to call out, to scream for someone, anyone, but I knew it would be useless. No one would hear me, and even if they did, they wouldn't get here in time. I backed away from the window, my heart racing, and grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a heavy, wooden baseball bat that had been leaning against the wall since the last time I'd gone out to the backyard to practice my swings. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. My hands trembled as I held it, trying to steady my breathing, trying to keep my mind from spiraling into full-blown panic. The noise was now unmistakably close, as if it were right outside, just beyond the back door. I could hear it clearly, a deep, guttural moan that sent a chill down my spine. It was accompanied by a soft rustling, like something large moving through the grass and underbrush, dragging itself toward the house. The thought of whatever it was getting any closer made my skin crawl, but I couldn't bring myself to move, frozen in place by fear. Suddenly, there was a loud thump against the back door, followed by a series of slow, deliberate scratching noises. It was as if something was testing the door, trying to find a way in. The sound of claws, or nails, dragging against the wood was maddening, sending waves of fear through me with each scrape. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest, the terror so intense that it left me feeling dizzy and lightheaded. I wanted to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The house that had always felt so secure now seemed like a prison, the walls closing in around me as the sounds grew more frantic, more insistent. The thumping and scratching continued, accompanied by that horrible, wounded animal-like moan, so close now that it felt like it was inside my head, echoing in my skull. I backed away from the door, my grip on the baseball bat tightening as I moved into the hallway, trying to put as much distance between myself and whatever was outside as possible. The only thought in my mind was to get away, to find some place where I could hide, where the walls were thicker and the door was solid enough to keep whatever it was out. I ducked into a closet at the far end of the hall, closing the door behind me as quietly as I could. The small, enclosed space was stifling, the air thick with the scent of old wood and musty clothes, but I didn't care. It felt safe, safer than being out in the open where that thing could find me. I crouched down, holding the bat in front of me like a shield, and tried to calm my racing heart, to quiet the thoughts that were screaming in my head. The sounds outside the door continued, but they were muffled now, distant and less distinct. I couldn't tell if whatever it was had moved away or if the closet walls were simply blocking out the noise. I tried to listen, to make out anything that would tell me what was happening, but all I could hear was my own ragged breathing, the blood pounding in my ears. Minutes passed, maybe hours, I couldn't tell. Time seemed to stretch and blur, the fear warping my perception of reality. All I could do was sit there in the dark, waiting, praying that whatever it was would go away, that I would wake up and find this was all just a nightmare. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. This was real, and it wasn't going to end until that thing outside decided to leave, or until it found a way in. Eventually, the noises stopped. The scratching, the thumping, the moaning, it all faded away, leaving only silence in its wake. But the silence was worse, somehow. It was a heavy, oppressive thing, filled with the possibility that whatever it was could still be out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. I stayed in the closet for what felt like an eternity, too scared to move, too scared to even breathe. The fear was like a living thing, wrapping itself around me, squeezing tighter with every passing second. I didn't dare leave the safety of the closet, didn't dare check to see if the coast was clear. I just stayed there, clutching the baseball bat, my eyes squeezed shut as I tried to block out the images of what might be waiting for me outside. When I finally emerged, the house was still, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. The memory of those sounds, the terror that had gripped me, was etched into my mind, a scar that would never fully heal. And though the night passed without further incident, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there would come back. That it wasn't done with me yet. The night Greg and I decided to investigate the rumors of a cult in the area was one that I'll never forget. It wasn't a decision we made lightly. After everything that had happened, the strange sounds, the mysterious figure in the woods, and the lingering fears that had taken root in my mind, I knew we were venturing into dangerous territory. But curiosity, mixed with a sense of defiance, drove us forward. We needed answers, and we were determined to find them, even if it meant facing the very thing we feared. It was late in the evening when we set out, the sky already darkening as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the trees. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, and the only sounds were the distant calls of night creatures awakening from their slumber. Greg and I walked in silence, the weight of what we were about to do hanging heavy between us. We both knew the stories, the tales our parents had told us in hushed tones, the warnings about the New Market cult that had terrorized the area years ago. But those stories had always seemed like just that, stories. Now, they felt all too real. Greg was the one who suggested we go at night. He figured that if there really was a cult out there, they wouldn't be active during the day. I wasn't so sure, but I didn't argue. Greg was a big guy, already towering over me at 6 feet 3 inches despite being only 14. His presence made me feel a little safer, like we might have a fighting chance if we ran into trouble. But even his size and strength couldn't shake the knot of fear that had settled in my stomach as we made our way down the dirt road. The road itself was little more than a narrow path, winding its way through the woods like a dark ribbon cutting through the trees. It was lined with thick underbrush, the shadows of the forest creeping ever closer as the night deepened. The deeper we ventured, the more the outside world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of us and the oppressive silence of the woods. As we walked, the sense of unease that had been nagging at me since we left the house began to grow. The night seemed unnaturally quiet, the usual sounds of crickets and frogs replaced by a heavy stillness that pressed down on us from all sides. I glanced over at Greg, and I could tell he felt it too. His normally confident stride had slowed, his eyes darting nervously around the trees as if expecting something to jump out at us at any moment. "Do you hear that?" Greg suddenly asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I strained my ears, but there was nothing, just the soft crunch of our footsteps on the dirt road. "I don't hear anything," I replied, my own voice hushed. "Exactly," Greg said, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the darkness. "It's too quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing." He was right. The silence was eerie, unnatural, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The air felt heavy, charged with a tension that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just our nerves getting the better of us, but the feeling only intensified as we continued down the road. The path grew steeper, leading us down a hill that opened into a flat pasture at the bottom. The dirt road continued along the edge of the pasture, running parallel to a creek that connected to the Flint River. The creek was barely visible in the darkness, just a sliver of black water reflecting the faint light of the moon. The sight of it, winding its way through the trees like a dark, serpentine creature, sent a shiver down my spine. We walked in silence for what felt like an eternity, the only sound the soft rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. Every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of something moving in the shadows, a deer, maybe, or a raccoon, but each time, my heart would skip a beat, my imagination conjuring up images of far more sinister things lurking just out of sight. The further we went, the more the paranoia began to set in. The path seemed to stretch on forever, each step taking us deeper into the heart of the woods, further away from the safety of the house. My mind raced with thoughts of what we might find out here, of the stories we had heard about strange rituals and dark figures that haunted these woods. I could feel the fear building inside me, a gnawing anxiety that threatened to overwhelm me if I let it. Greg, too, was growing more uneasy. I could see it in the way he kept glancing over his shoulder, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Despite his size and strength, he was just as scared as I was, and the realization that even Greg was afraid made my own fear that much more intense. We reached a point where the dirt road narrowed, flanked by dense underbrush on either side. The trees overhead formed a thick canopy, blocking out what little moonlight there was and plunging us into near-total darkness. It was here that the path veered off into a thick tree line, the branches so tightly woven together that it was almost impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. I knew this place. It was the same tree line where I had seen the man with the deer skull mask, the same place where my sister and I had felt those eyes watching us. A sense of dread settled over me as we stood at the edge of the trees, the memory of that day flooding back with terrifying clarity. I could almost feel those eyes on us again, the weight of that gaze pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. My instincts were screaming at me to turn back, to get as far away from this place as possible, but I couldn't move, rooted to the spot by a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. "We shouldn't be here," I whispered, my voice trembling. "We need to go back." Greg didn't respond right away. He was staring into the darkness ahead, his expression tense, as if he was trying to decide whether to push forward or listen to the voice of reason. Finally, he shook his head, his jaw set in determination. "We came this far," he said quietly. "We need to know what's out there." Despite my better judgment, I nodded. There was a part of me that didn't want to leave without answers, that needed to know if the stories were true, if the cult was real. But as we stepped into the tree line, pushing our way through the dense underbrush, the fear only intensified. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sounds the rustling of leaves underfoot and the occasional snap of a twig. The further we went, the thicker the trees became, the branches clawing at our clothes like skeletal hands. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the adrenaline coursing through my veins as every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn back. And then, everything went still. The wind died down, the rustling of the leaves stopped, and the night seemed to hold its breath. Greg and I came to an abrupt halt, our breath hitching in our throats as the sudden silence enveloped us. It was as if the forest itself had gone quiet, as if every living thing around us had sensed the same thing we had, that we weren't alone. I looked at Greg, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. We were both on edge, every instinct telling us that something was wrong, that we were being watched. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the silence, but all I could feel was the growing sense of dread that threatened to overwhelm me. And then, we heard it, a soft snap, like a twig breaking underfoot, coming from somewhere deep in the woods. We both spun around, our eyes darting frantically through the trees, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. The fear was palpable now, a living, breathing thing that wrapped itself around us, squeezing tighter with each passing second. And then we saw him. There, just a few feet away, standing partially obscured by the thick branches, was a tall figure. He was wearing what looked like a deer skull over his face, the empty eye sockets staring back at us, hollow and menacing. He was so close, too close, and I could see every detail, the twisted antlers protruding from the skull, the way his hand gripped a small tree for balance as he leaned forward, watching us. Time seemed to slow as we stared at him, our minds racing, trying to process what we were seeing. My heart pounded in my chest, my body frozen in place by fear. I could feel Greg beside me, equally paralyzed, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. And then, without warning, a scream pierced the air, a high-pitched, blood-curdling sound that jolted us out of our trance. It came from somewhere deep within the woods, a sound so filled with terror that it sent a wave of panic crashing over me. That was all it took. Greg and I didn't wait to see what would happen next. We turned and ran, our feet pounding against the earth as we tore through the underbrush, the trees whipping at our faces and arms as we fled. The fear was all-consuming, a primal instinct that drove us forward, pushing us to run faster, harder, until all I could feel was the burning in my lungs and the adrenaline coursing through my veins. The world around us blurred as we sprinted back up the hill, our only thought to get as far away from that place as possible. The hour-long walk we had taken was now a frenzied sprint, our footsteps echoing in the stillness as we raced for safety. I couldn't feel anything but the raw, unrelenting terror that urged me on. The images of that figure burned into my mind, driving me to run faster than I ever had before. We didn't stop until we reached the abandoned dry cleaners, panting and gasping for breath as we collapsed onto the pavement. My legs were trembling, my body shaking with the aftershocks of adrenaline, and when I looked at Greg, I saw that he was just as shaken. His eyes were wide, tears streaming down his face as he tried to catch his breath. We sat there for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The fear had left us both rattled, and as we talked in hushed, frantic whispers, it became clear that we had both seen the same thing, the man with the deer skull mask, the figure that had been watching us from the trees. We debated whether to call the cops, to report what we had seen, but the fear of not being believed, of being dismissed as kids with overactive imaginations, kept us from doing so. Greg eventually made the call anyway, but when the cops arrived, they didn't find anything, just ashes from an old fire, which they chalked up to campers. Greg went home, and I returned to my grandparents' house, the fear still gnawing at me. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had disturbed something we shouldn't have, something dark and dangerous that wouldn't let us go so easily. And as I drifted off to sleep, my mind was filled with images of that man in the woods, the empty eyes of the deer skull staring back at me, a silent reminder that whatever was out there wasn't done with us yet. The night was already steeped in tension as Greg and I made our way deeper into the woods, but nothing could have prepared us for what we encountered next. The thick canopy of trees above us blocked out nearly all the moonlight, casting the forest in an oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow us whole. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, and every step we took felt like it was drawing us further into a place we had no business being. As we pushed through the dense underbrush, the sense of unease that had been growing since we started our journey down the dirt road turned into something much more potent, a raw, gut-wrenching fear that gnawed at the edges of my mind. I could feel it in the way the woods had gone eerily silent, the usual chorus of night creatures replaced by a stillness that was almost suffocating. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Greg was just ahead of me, his large frame moving carefully through the tangled branches. Even though he was usually the brave one, I could tell he was on edge. His shoulders were tense, and he kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting something, or someone, to appear behind us at any moment. I wanted to say something to reassure him, but the words caught in my throat, strangled by the growing fears that had taken hold of me. Then, out of nowhere, we heard it, a soft snap, the unmistakable sound of a twig breaking underfoot. We both froze, our hearts leaping into our throats as we turned toward the sound. My pulse quickened, each beat thudding loudly in my ears as my eyes strained to see through the darkness. But the shadows were too thick, the night too deep, and all I could make out were the vague shapes of trees and underbrush. For a moment, there was nothing, just the echo of that broken twig hanging in the air, a harbinger of something sinister. I could feel Greg beside me, his breath shallow and fast, and I knew he was feeling the same sense of dread that had taken hold of me. We were not alone. And then we saw him. He stepped out from behind a tree, just a few feet away from us, and the sight of him was enough to freeze the blood in my veins. The man was tall, impossibly tall, his frame elongated and twisted in a way that seemed unnatural. His limbs were long and thin, almost spindly, and his posture was hunched, as if he were crouching slightly, ready to spring at any moment. But it wasn't just his shape that sent waves of terror crashing over me, it was what he was wearing. His face was obscured by a deer skull, the hollow eye sockets staring back at us with an empty, lifeless gaze. The antlers jutted out from his head like twisted branches, casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. The skull was old, weathered by time and the elements, but there was something disturbingly deliberate about the way he wore it, as if it were a part of him, as if he had become one with the creature whose remains he now bore. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, locked in a silent standoff with this nightmare figure. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing, but the sheer impossibility of it all left me paralyzed with fear. This wasn't just some person playing a cruel prank. There was something deeply wrong about this man, something that defied explanation. The way he moved, the way he watched us, it was as if he were studying us, sizing us up, deciding what to do with the intruders who had stumbled into his domain. I could feel my body trembling, the cold sweat dripping down my back as the reality of the situation set in. We were alone, deep in the woods, with no one to help us, and this thing was standing between us and any hope of escape. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to break the spell that had trapped us in place, but I couldn't move, couldn't tear my eyes away from the sight of that deer skull mask and the man behind it. Greg was the first to break the silence. He took a step back, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get out of here," he said, the fear clear in his tone. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak, and slowly began to move backward, mirroring Greg's steps. But the man didn't move. He just watched us, his head tilting slightly to the side, as if curious about our reaction. It was that slight movement, that almost animalistic gesture, that finally snapped me out of my paralysis. "Run," I whispered, my voice shaking with fear. "Run, now." We turned and bolted, adrenaline surging through our bodies as we sprinted back the way we had come. The forest around us became a blur of shadows and shapes, the branches tearing at our clothes and skin as we crashed through the underbrush. All I could think about was getting away, putting as much distance between us and that man as possible. But the fear followed us, clinging to us like a cold, wet blanket that we couldn't shake off. Every step felt like it took us deeper into the darkness, as if the forest itself were conspiring to keep us from escaping. I could hear Greg's heavy breathing beside me, his footfalls pounding against the ground as we ran, but I didn't dare look back, didn't dare slow down. The only thing that mattered was getting away. The woods seemed to close in around us, the trees growing thicker, the path narrower, until it felt like we were running through a tunnel of shadows. The darkness was so complete that I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me, and the fears that we might run into something, or someone, was almost paralyzing. But I pushed it down, forced myself to keep moving, to keep running, because the alternative was unthinkable. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the woods started to thin out. I could see the faint outline of the dirt road ahead, the trees giving way to open space, and a flicker of hope ignited in my chest. We were almost there, we were almost out. But as we broke through the tree line and onto the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched, that the man with the deer skull mask was still out there, lurking just beyond the edge of the darkness. The fear didn't fade as we sprinted down the road, our footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. If anything, it grew stronger, a constant reminder that we had encountered something far beyond our understanding, something that wouldn't let us go so easily. We didn't stop running until we reached the dry cleaners, our lungs burning, our bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. We collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for breath, our minds racing as we tried to make sense of what had just happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the image of that man, the twisted limbs, the hollow eyes of the deer skull, the way he had watched us with that unnerving, predatory curiosity. Greg was shaking, tears streaming down his face as he tried to catch his breath. I was in no better shape, my body racked with tremors, my mind struggling to process the raw terror that had overtaken us. We talked in hushed whispers, trying to reassure each other that we were safe now, that we had escaped. But deep down, I knew that we hadn't. The fear still clung to us, a dark shadow that followed us even as we made our way back home. The man with the deer skull mask was still out there, somewhere in those woods, and I had the sinking feeling that our encounter with him was far from over. We had barely managed to escape with our lives, but the terror of that night would stay with us, haunting our thoughts, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the edge of our understanding. It was the day after the encounter in the woods with Greg, and I was still reeling from the terror of what we had seen. My mind was a chaotic mess of fear, confusion, and disbelief. I had barely slept, every creak and groan of the old house jolting me awake, my imagination running wild with visions of the man with the deer skull mask. I kept replaying the events of that night in my head, trying to make sense of what had happened, but the more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had stumbled into something dark and dangerous, something that wasn't finished with us yet. I was alone at my grandparents' house that afternoon, my grandparents having gone out to run some errands. The house was quiet, the only sound the occasional rustling of leaves outside and the distant hum of a car passing by on the road. I was trying to distract myself with some TV, but my mind kept drifting back to the woods, to that twisted figure watching us from the shadows. I felt like I was being watched even now, the unease gnawing at me, making it impossible to relax. That's when the phone rang, breaking the silence and startling me out of my thoughts. I grabbed it, more out of reflex than anything else, and saw my mom's name on the caller ID. It was strange, she rarely called, especially during the day. My parents had their own problems, and our relationship had been strained for as long as I could remember. Still, I answered, thinking maybe she had something important to say. "Hello?" I said, trying to keep the nervousness out of my voice. At first, there was nothing but silence on the other end, just the faint sound of breathing. I felt a chill run down my spine, the unease I had been feeling all day suddenly sharpening into fear. I called out again, a little louder this time, but the only response was more breathing, slow and deliberate, like someone was listening, waiting. I tried to convince myself it was just a bad connection, some kind of glitch, but the longer the silence dragged on, the more unsettled I became. I hung up, my heart pounding in my chest, and immediately called her back. This time, she picked up almost instantly, her voice as casual as if nothing had happened. "What's up?" she asked, sounding slightly distracted. "Did you just call me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She paused for a moment, then answered, "No, why?" I felt a knot of anxieties tighten in my stomach. "I just got a call from your number," but all I heard was breathing. There was a brief silence on her end, then a nervous laugh. "Probably just a glitch. These phones are always acting up." I wanted to believe her, but something about the way she brushed it off didn't sit right with me. Before I could press her further, she changed the subject, telling me that she was dropping off a package for me at the house. I didn't get a chance to ask her why or what it was before she hung up. Not long after, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. I peered out the window and saw my mom's car, its headlights off, parked at an odd angle. She didn't get out of the car, just stayed there for a moment, then leaned over to the passenger seat and rolled down the window. A package, wrapped in brown paper, was tossed out onto the driveway. Without a word, she reversed out of the driveway and drove off, the tires crunching on the gravel as she disappeared down the road. I stood there for a moment, staring at the package, unease churning in my gut. Something about this didn't feel right. My mom's behavior was odd, even for her, and the way she had just tossed the package out of the car and left without a word, it sent a wave of dread washing over me. But I couldn't just leave it there, so I stepped outside, my eyes darting around the yard, half expecting to see someone watching from the shadows. The package was small, long, and wrapped hastily, the brown paper crinkled and tied with a rough piece of twine. It felt heavy in my hands, heavier than I expected, and as I held it, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was inside was something I didn't want to see. But curiosity and a sense of obligation made me take it inside, where I placed it on the kitchen table. I hesitated before untying the twine, my hands trembling slightly. Something about this package felt wrong, and I couldn't help but feel that whatever was inside was meant to send a message. With a deep breath, I began to unwrap it, the paper tearing easily to reveal a wooden box underneath, its surface worn and scratched as if it had seen better days. The box itself was unsettling, long and narrow, with a simple latch that looked like it had been broken and hastily repaired. The wood was dark, almost black, and there were strange symbols carved into the sides, symbols that I didn't recognize but that filled me with an inexplicable sense of dread. My mind raced, trying to figure out where this had come from and why my mom would have brought it to me, but no answers came. Taking another deep breath, I opened the box. Inside, nestled in a bed of dried hay, was a knife. But it wasn't just any knife, it was old, rusted, and covered in a patina of age and neglect. The blade was long and twisted, its edge jagged and uneven, as if it had been used for something far more sinister than cutting bread or carving wood. The handle was what drew my attention the most, though, a carved snake, its body coiled around the hilt, its head forming the pommel, its eyes made of tiny, glittering stones that seemed to stare back at me with malevolent intent. A wave of nausea hit me as I stared at the knife, the reality of what I was holding sinking in. This wasn't just a knife, it was a message, a threat. The rust, the twisted blade, the snake handle, it all pointed to something dark, something ancient and malevolent. My hands began to shake as I realized that whoever had sent this package wanted to make it clear that they knew who I was, that they could get to me, and that they weren't afraid to use something like this. Fear gripped me as I carefully set the knife back in the box, my mind racing with questions. Who had sent this? Was it connected to the man with the deer skull mask? Had my mom been threatened, forced to deliver this package without knowing what was inside? Or worse, did she know exactly what she was bringing to me? I didn't have any answers, but one thing was certain, this knife was meant to send a message, and the message was clear, I was being watched, and whoever was out there wanted me to know that they were coming for me. My first instinct was to get rid of the knife, to bury it deep in the woods where no one would ever find it. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I put the box back together as carefully as I could, my hands trembling with fear and adrenaline. I didn't want to touch the knife, didn't want to leave my fingerprints on it, so I grabbed a pair of gloves from the kitchen drawer and wrapped the box back up, making sure to keep the paper intact. I placed the package on the far end of the table, as far away from me as possible, and sat down heavily in the nearest chair, my mind reeling. The fear was almost suffocating now, a cold, dark presence that seemed to fill the room, pressing down on me from all sides. I couldn't escape it, couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that things were going to get much worse. The rest of the day passed in a blur of anxiety and dread. I couldn't stop thinking about the knife, about the implications of what it meant. I kept glancing at the package, half expecting it to move on its own, to open and reveal some new horror. But it remained where I had left it, a silent reminder of the danger that was closing in around me. When my grandparents finally returned home, I didn't say anything about the package. I didn't want to worry them, didn't want to involve them in something that could put them in danger. But the fear never left me, a constant companion as I tried to go about my day as if everything was normal. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the knife, about the snake handle and the twisted blade. The fear had burrowed deep into my mind, and I knew that I was being drawn into something far darker than I could have ever imagined. Something that I might not be able to escape from. The night the cult surrounded our house was unlike any other. It began like so many before it, quiet, still, with the usual creaks and groans of our old wooden home. But there was a tension in the air, an unsettling quiet that seemed to press in from all sides. My mother had been acting strange all evening, her nerves frayed, her eyes constantly darting toward the windows as if expecting to see something, or someone, lurking outside. I could feel the fear radiating off her, a fear that quickly seeped into my own bones, setting my nerves on edge. My grandparents were out of town, leaving just the two of us in the house. I knew she was on high alert after everything that had happened, the strange noises, the man with the deer skull mask, the eerie package with the rusted knife. We both were. But that night, there was something different about the way she moved, the way she kept glancing out into the darkness beyond the windows. It was as if she knew something was coming, something she had been dreading for a long time. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, trying to focus on my homework, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over the house like a heavy fog. My mother was pacing the room, her eyes fixed on the darkness outside, her fingers gripping the edge of the countertop so tightly that her knuckles were white. I wanted to ask her what was wrong, but the words caught in my throat, the fear too thick, too tangible to speak around. Then, just as the clock struck midnight, we heard it, a low, eerie melody drifting through the air, barely audible at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. The sound sent a shiver down my spine, my skin prickling with the sensation that something was terribly, terribly wrong. My mother froze in place, her eyes widening with a fear that I had never seen before. I listened, my heart pounding in my chest, as the music grew louder, clearer. It was a strange, haunting tune, unlike anything I had ever heard before. The notes were discordant, unsettling, like the soundtrack to a nightmare. It filled the air, echoing off the walls of the house, seeping into every corner until there was no escape from it. It was coming from outside, but it felt like it was inside too, crawling under my skin, setting my nerves on fire. My mother moved quickly, grabbing the shotgun she had kept hidden in the pantry, her face pale and set with determination. "Get away from the windows," she ordered, her voice sharp and laced with fear. I didn't hesitate, scrambling away from the kitchen and into the living room, my pulse racing as the music continued to swell, growing louder, more insistent. As I backed away from the windows, I heard another sound, scratching. It was faint at first, like the sound of tree branches brushing against the glass, but then it grew louder, more deliberate. It was coming from all sides, from every window in the house, a relentless scratching that seemed to be closing in on us. My heart pounded in my ears as I stared at the windows, half expecting to see something looking back at me through the glass. "They're here," my mother whispered, her voice trembling as she moved to the front door, the shotgun clutched tightly in her hands. "They've come for us." "Who?" I managed to ask, though I already knew the answer. "The cult," she replied, her voice barely audible over the eerie music and the scratching. "The same people who came for me when I was your age. They found us again." I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The cult, those shadowy figures we had heard about in whispers, the ones who had terrorized my parents when they were kids, they were real, and they were here, right outside our house. The music grew louder, the tune more distorted, more menacing, as if it were designed to unnerve us, to drive us to the brink of madness. The scratching intensified, becoming more frantic, more aggressive, like nails dragging across the glass, desperate to get inside. I could hear the sound moving around the house, from one window to the next, as if they were testing every possible entry point, searching for a way in. My mother stood in the center of the living room, her back to me, her eyes fixed on the front door as she slowly raised the shotgun, ready to fire at the first sign of movement. I could see the fear in her, but I could also see the resolve. She wasn't going to let them take us without a fight. I grabbed the baseball bat I had stashed behind the couch, the same one I had clung to the night I heard those strange, wounded animal-like sounds outside. It felt heavy in my hands, the wood solid and comforting, but I knew it wouldn't do much good against whoever, or whatever, was out there. Still, it was better than nothing. The music was unbearable now, a cacophony of twisted notes and dissonant chords that seemed to vibrate through the walls, rattling the windows in their frames. The scratching had turned into pounding, as if fists were beating against the glass, trying to shatter it, to get inside. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I stood there, gripping the bat so tightly that my hands ached. And then, suddenly, everything went quiet. The music stopped, the scratching ceased, and the house was plunged into an eerie silence that was even more terrifying than the noise. My mother and I stood frozen, our hearts pounding in the stillness, waiting for something, anything, to happen. A creak sounded from the garage, the door connecting it to the kitchen slowly swinging open with a groan that echoed through the house. My mother and I turned in unison, our eyes locked on the door as it opened wider, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. The air was thick with tension, the silence so heavy it felt like it was pressing down on us, suffocating us. Then, the music started again, but this time it was coming from inside the house. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it was unmistakable. The same eerie melody, twisted and distorted, was now echoing through the hallways, as if the very walls were humming with it. My mother's grip on the shotgun tightened, her eyes darting around the room as she tried to locate the source of the sound. I felt a cold dread settle over me, the realization that they were inside the house, that they had somehow gotten in without us knowing. I could feel their presence, a malevolent force that seemed to linger just out of sight, watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Get to the car," my mother hissed, her voice tense. "We need to get out of here now." I didn't argue. We moved as quickly as we could, my mother leading the way with the shotgun raised, her finger hovering over the trigger. The front door was just a few feet away, but it felt like miles, the distance stretching out as we inched closer, every step filled with the fear that something would jump out at us, that the cult would spring their trap before we could escape. Just as we reached the door, a loud bang echoed through the house, followed by the sound of shattering glass. My heart lurched in my chest as I spun around, my eyes darting to the source of the noise. One of the windows in the living room had been broken, shards of glass littering the floor, and I could see a dark figure outside, their face obscured by a hood, their hands still pressed against the now broken pane. My mother didn't hesitate. She fired the shotgun, the deafening blast ringing in my ears as the figure outside stumbled back, disappearing into the darkness. But the sound of the shot seemed to trigger something in the cult. They began pounding on the walls, the windows, the doors, their fists and nails and whatever else they were using, creating a cacophony of noise that filled the house. "Go," my mother shouted, shoving me toward the door. I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking so badly that it took me several tries to get it open. When I finally did, we burst out into the night, the cool air hitting us like a slap to the face. We didn't stop running until we reached the car, my mother yanking the driver's side door open and shoving me inside before climbing in herself. She jammed the keys into the ignition, her hands trembling as she started the engine. The headlights flicked on, illuminating the driveway and the front of the house, where more hooded figures were emerging from the shadows, their faces hidden, their movements slow and deliberate. The car roared to life, and my mother floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as we tore out of the driveway and down the road. I looked back just once, and what I saw sent a chill down my spine, a tall man, wearing a deerskull mask, standing on the roof of our house, his empty eye sockets staring directly at us as we sped away. We didn't stop driving for hours, my mother gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles were white, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. The fear didn't leave me, not even as we put miles between us and the house. It clung to me, a cold, suffocating presence that wouldn't let go. I knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. The cult had found us, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. And the terrifying truth was, I didn't know if we could escape them. The moment we realized the cult had broken into our home was like stepping into a waking nightmare. Everything that had seemed safe and familiar was suddenly twisted, corrupted by the presence of those dark figures who had somehow invaded our sanctuary. My heart pounded in my chest as the reality of the situation sank in. Our home was no longer a refuge, it had become a trap, and we were caught in it. The eerie music had been bad enough, the scratching at the windows unsettling in a way that made my skin crawl. But the sudden, deafening crash of glass shattering in the living room was what snapped us out of our fear-induced paralysis. It was a sound that ripped through the house like a gunshot, loud and jarring, leaving no doubt in our minds that we were in immediate danger. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a cold, hard rush that overpowered the fear, propelling us into action. My mother didn't hesitate. The shotgun was in her hands, her eyes sharp and focused despite the terror that I knew was gripping her just as tightly as it was gripping me. The air was thick with tension, the silence that followed the crash almost suffocating as we waited for what would come next. My mind raced, trying to grasp the reality of what was happening, but there was no time to process it. We had to move, and we had to move fast. "Get to the car," she ordered, her voice steady but urgent. I could see the fear in her eyes, but also a fierce determination. She was going to protect us, no matter what. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak, and we bolted for the front door. The hallway seemed impossibly long, the shadows stretching out like dark, grasping hands that clawed at the edges of my vision. My feet pounded against the floor, the sound echoing in the narrow space as we ran, the house now feeling more like a labyrinth designed to trap us than the safe haven it had always been. We reached the front door just as another window shattered, the noise sharp and violent in the otherwise silent night. I could hear the pounding of footsteps behind us, the thudding of boots on wooden floors as the cult members made their way inside. The realization that they were in the house, that they were already inside, closing in on us, sent a spike of terror through me, a cold, visceral fear that threatened to overwhelm my senses. My hands shook as I fumbled with the lock, my fingers slipping on the cold metal as I tried desperately to get the door open. Every second felt like an eternity, the sounds of the intruders drawing closer, filling the house with the heavy, menacing presence of people who meant us harm. Finally, the lock clicked open, and I yanked the door wide, stumbling out into the night. The cool night air hit me like a shock, a sudden, harsh contrast to the oppressive atmosphere inside the house. But there was no time to savor the relief of being outside. We had to keep moving. The car was parked in the driveway, just a few feet away, but it might as well have been miles for all the safety it represented. I sprinted toward it, my heart hammering in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to move faster, to get out before they caught up to us. My mother was right behind me, the shotgun clutched tightly in her hands as she scanned the darkness around us, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow, searching for any sign of movement. But it wasn't the shadows we had to worry about, it was what was above us. As I reached the car, I glanced back toward the house, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There, perched on the roof like some twisted gargoyle, was a tall figure wearing a deer skull mask. His antlers jetted out against the night sky, casting jagged shadows across the ground. He stood there, perfectly still, the hollow eye sockets of the skull staring down at us with an eerie, almost predatory focus. It was a sight straight out of a nightmare, surreal and terrifying in its quiet intensity. The man didn't move, didn't make a sound, he simply watched, as if waiting to see what we would do next. The stillness of it, the sheer wrongness of seeing someone standing on the roof of our home, sent a jolt of fear through me so powerful that it nearly knocked the breath from my lungs. But that wasn't the worst of it. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw more figures emerging from the shadows around the house. They were on the roof, in the yard, standing silently in the darkness like specters come to life. Each one wore a hooded cloak, their faces hidden, their bodies shrouded in black. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if they had all the time in the world, as if they knew we were trapped. "Get in the car," my mother shouted, her voice snapping me out of my stunned horror. I threw open the passenger door and scrambled inside, slamming it shut behind me as she dove into the driver's seat. She fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking, and for a terrifying moment, I thought they wouldn't start. But then the engine roared to life, the headlights cutting through the darkness and illuminating the driveway in harsh, blinding light. The cult members scattered like insects caught in the beam, their hoods and cloaks swirling around them as they moved. My mother floored the gas pedal, and the car lurched forward, the tires screeching against the pavement as we sped out of the driveway. I twisted in my seat to look back, and what I saw would haunt me for the rest of my life. The cult members were standing in the yard, watching us go. They made no move to stop us, no attempt to follow, just stood there, silent and still, their faces hidden in shadow. The man with the deer skull mask remained on the roof, his form outlined against the night sky like a dark silhouette. As we drove away, I could see his head slowly turning to follow us, the empty eye sockets seeming to bore into the back of my skull, even from a distance. The car rocketed down the road, the trees on either side blurring as we sped through the night. My mother's hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel, her eyes locked on the road ahead, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. I could feel my own heart racing, the adrenaline surging through my veins, but even as we put more distance between ourselves and the house, the fear didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger, the realization sinking in that we had barely escaped with our lives. "Are you okay?" my mother asked, her voice trembling as she glanced over at me. I nodded, but I didn't trust myself to speak. My throat was dry, my hand still trembling as I clutched the edge of the seat. I kept replaying the sight of those figures in my mind, the way they had just watched us leave, their presence more unsettling than any direct attack could have been. It was as if they had wanted us to know that they could have stopped us, that they could have done far worse, but had chosen to let us go, for now. The road stretched out before us, empty and dark, the world outside the car feeling distant and unreal. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched, that those hollow eye sockets of the deer skull mask were still fixed on us, even miles away. The fear clung to me, a suffocating presence that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. The house, our home, was behind us now, but I knew that we weren't truly safe. We drove for hours, neither of us speaking, the silence in the car heavy with unspoken terror. My mother's face was set in a grim expression, her eyes never leaving the road as she drove, as if she were trying to outrun the fears that had taken hold of us. But no matter how fast we went, no matter how far we drove, I knew that the cult was still out there, that they weren't done with us yet. And as we drove on into the night, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen when they decided to come after us again. As we sped away from the house, the sense of relief was almost overwhelming, but it was tinged with an undercurrent of lingering fear that clung to us like a shadow. The further we got from the place that had been our home, the more that relief began to wash over me, a powerful surge of emotion that left me feeling lightheaded and weak. The terrifying sight of the cult members, the eerie music, the relentless scratching at the windows, all of it was behind us now, receding into the distance as we drove deeper into the night. But even as that initial wave of relief swept over me, I couldn't shake the fear that still lingered, just beneath the surface. The fear that at any moment, the cult could reappear, that the man with the deer skull mask could materialize out of the darkness, those hollow eye sockets fixed on us as we tried to flee. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see them following us, but the road behind was empty, the dark trees lining the highway like silent sentinels. My mother's hands were still gripping the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white as she kept her eyes locked on the road ahead. The tension in the car was palpable, a silent acknowledgement that while we had escaped for now, the threat hadn't truly passed. I could see it in her expression, the way her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror every few seconds, the way her shoulders were still hunched with tension. She was relieved too, but like me, she couldn't fully believe that we were safe just yet. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence in the car was heavy, filled with the echoes of everything that had just happened. My mind was still racing, replaying the events of the night over and over, trying to process the horror of it all. The memories were sharp and vivid, the sight of those figures standing in the yard, the man on the roof, the eerie music that had filled the house. It all felt surreal, like something out of a nightmare, but the fear that accompanied those memories was all too real. As we drove, the landscape around us began to change. The dense forest that had surrounded our home gradually gave way to open fields and rolling hills, the trees thinning out until they were little more than dark shapes on the horizon. The night sky stretched out above us, vast and starless, and the road seemed to stretch on forever, an endless ribbon of asphalt leading us away from the danger we had narrowly escaped. The further we drove, the more the fear began to subside, though it never fully disappeared. It was as if the distance between us and the house was a buffer, a protective shield that would keep the cult at bay. But there was also a nagging uncertainty that gnawed at the back of my mind, the knowledge that distance alone might not be enough to keep us safe. The cult had found us once, who was to say they couldn't find us again? "We'll be okay," my mother finally said, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, but there was a tremor in it that betrayed her lingering fear. "We got away. We're safe now." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that the worst was behind us, that we had left the terror of the cult behind on that dark road. But the fear was still there, gnawing at me, whispering that it wasn't over, that they could come after us again. The memory of those figures, their hooded faces hidden in shadow, was burned into my mind, a constant reminder that the threat was real, and it was out there, somewhere. "I know," I replied, though my voice was shaky. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to calm the anxiety that still lingered in my chest. "We got away." The words felt hollow, as if saying them out loud might somehow jinx our escape, might bring the cult back to us. But I could see that my mother needed to hear them, needed the reassurance just as much as I did. She had been strong for both of us, had kept her fear at bay long enough to get us out of that house, but now that we were on the road, the full weight of what we had been through was starting to show. We drove on in silence for a while longer, the road empty except for the occasional car that passed by, its headlights briefly illuminating the interior of our vehicle before fading into the darkness. The world outside felt strange, almost alien, as if we had crossed some invisible boundary into a place where the rules were different, where the normalcy of our lives had been shattered and replaced by something far more sinister. As we put more miles between us and the house, the fear gradually began to ebb, replaced by a cautious sense of hope. Maybe we had escaped. Maybe the cult wouldn't be able to find us again. The thought was a fragile one, easily crushed by the lingering anxiety that clung to me, but it was there nonetheless, a small flicker of light in the darkness, something to hold onto as we faced an uncertain future. But with that hope came the realization that everything had changed. The life we had known was gone, left behind with the shattered windows and the eerie music that had haunted our home. We were heading into the unknown, leaving everything familiar behind in a desperate attempt to stay one step ahead of the danger that had found us. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My mother glanced over at me, her expression softening. "We keep moving," she said quietly. "We find somewhere safe, somewhere they can't reach us." The uncertainty in her voice was clear. She didn't know where that place might be, or if it even existed. But there was determination too, a resolve that gave me some small measure of comfort. We would figure it out together. We had to. As the first faint light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I allowed myself to relax, if only a little. The world outside the car was still dark, still filled with shadows and the unknown, but the sight of that soft, pale light brought with it a sense of renewal, a promise that the night was ending, that we had made it through. But even as I clung to that hope, I knew that the fear would never fully leave me. It was a part of me now, woven into the fabric of my thoughts and memories. The cult was out there, somewhere in the darkness, and I knew that we would never truly be free of them. They had reached us once, and they could do it again. But for now, we had escaped. We had left everything behind, and the road stretched out ahead of us, leading us to a future that was uncertain, but ours to claim. And as we drove on, the sun slowly rising behind us, I allowed myself to believe, if only for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, we had finally outrun the darkness that had been chasing us. This is where the story ends. Share your opinion in the comments. Did you like the story?